Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping straight into a really interesting mix of sources, kicking things off with a crucial editorial. Our goal, as always, is to pull out the key insights, the surprising bits, basically giving you a shortcut to being genuinely informed. We've got quite a range today, geopolitics, some major economic shifts, and even some pretty mind-bending science. So let's get right into it. First up, West Asia.
Okay, so tensions are high again in West Asia. It brings that persistent question back into focus. Can military action actually dismantle Iran's nuclear program? We're looking at an editorial by Sabain Amir that tackles this head on. The core question is, well, is a surgical strike even really feasible? What's Amir's take?
Well, Amir's analysis is pretty direct. The short answer, no, or certainly not easily. The main problem is Iran's nuclear infrastructure itself. You look at facilities like Fordo. I mean, these aren't just hardened targets. They're buried deep, like 80 to 100 meters underground, reinforced with layers of steel, concrete. Natanz is similar. These places were designed, over decades specifically to survive military attacks, make some very different targets.
Right, so these deep bunkers, conventional bombs just aren't going to cut it, are they?
Exactly. To have any chance of penetrating these, you need incredibly specialized weapons. We're talking about things like the U.S.-developed GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the MOP. This thing is huge, like 30,000 pounds, precision-guided, built to go deep, maybe 60 meters of earth, 18 of reinforced concrete. But, and this is crucial, Amir points out Israel doesn't actually have this bomb, and they don't have the B-2 or B-52 bombers you'd need to even carry it.
Okay, so even with Israel's advanced tech, like their F-35s.
Well, their upgraded F-35I fighters can carry GBU-28 bunker busters. These are powerful. They can penetrate maybe 5 or 6 meters of concrete, but that's just not enough for the really deep sites, like Fordo. It wouldn't guarantee destruction.
This sounds completely different from those past Israeli strikes people mention, like Osirak in Iraq back in '81, or Al-Kibar in Syria in 2007. What makes Iran's situation so distinct?
Yeah, those comparisons don't really hold up. Those targets were, well, isolated. They were above ground. And critically, they were in the very early stages of development. Iran's program, it's decades old, it's mature technologically, it's spread out across multiple sites, many duplicated, and like we said, heavily fortified. Plus, Iran has shown it can rebuild. Think about the Stuxnet attack in 2010. They learned from that. It's just a whole different level of challenge.
And setting aside the pure technical difficulty of a successful strike, what about the bigger picture, the strategic risks, the potential fallout?
Oh, the risks of escalation are massive. Everyone recognizes this. Iran has explicitly warned of a crushing response. And we saw what they can do back in April 2024, right? They launched over 300 drones and missiles at Israel. That was a serious demonstration, a full-blown regional war. That would be catastrophic. You'd see global oil supplies massively disrupted. It would destabilize states that are already pretty fragile, and it could drag other countries into a long conflict, a conflict that, importantly, might not even achieve the goal of ending Iran's nuclear potential anyway.
So if military action isn't really a viable path to completely shutting down the program, what's the alternative? What does Amir argue is the way forward?
Amir brings it back to diplomacy. It's imperfect, sure, but she argues it's really the only viable option left. Remember the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA? It did place restrictions and allow international inspections to some degree. Now, yes, since the U.S. pulled out in 2018, Iran has violated those terms. Stockpiles are way up. Enrichment is at 60%. Cooperation with the IAEA is down. But Amir's core point remains, this idea of a neat, clean, surgical strike. It's not just difficult. She calls it a dangerous illusion. It misunderstands the scale of the challenge and ignores the huge potential for devastating escalation. What's needed, she says, is serious, sustained diplomacy backed by multilateral pressure.
Okay, shifting gears now. From West Asia's complexities, let's look at a surprising economic picture closer to home, South Asia. Shashank Patel's article brings up a really striking statistic. South Asia is actually one of the least economically integrated regions globally.
Right.
What does that actually mean in practice? How bad is it compared to others?
It's pretty stark when you see the numbers. Trade within the South Asian Free Trade Area, SAFTA, makes up only about 5 to 7% of the region's total international trade. Just to compare, think about the EU interregional trade there is around 45%, or ASEAN, that's 22%, NAFTA, around 25%. So yeah, 5 to 7%. It really highlights how disconnected South Asian economies are despite being neighbors.
And the potential that's just sitting there, untapped. It sounds enormous. Current trade is around $23 billion, but estimates suggest it could be $67 billion.
Yeah.
Some studies even higher.
Exactly. The potential is huge. One Uniscap study even projected it could have hit $172 billion by 2020, which obviously didn't happen. And for specific countries, the missed opportunity is massive. Bangladesh, for example, is estimated to have something like a 93% unexploited trade potential within the region. Pakistan, 86%. We see the real-world impact, too. Look at India-Pakistan trade. It fell from about $2.4 billion in 2018 down to $1.2 billion in 2024. And Pakistani exports to India, they practically vanished, just $480,000 in 2024. It shows a deep economic disconnect.
So why? What's stopping the region from realizing this potential? What are the big roadblocks?
Patel points to several things, but a really surprising one is just how expensive it is to trade within South Asia. It costs, on average, 114% of the value of the goods just to export them within the region. That's incredibly high. Here's a wild example. It costs an Indian company about 20% more to trade with Pakistan than with Brazil, which is, 22 times farther away? That kind of cost actively discourages building regional supply chains.
Wow. And why is it so expensive?
The core reasons Patel cites are things like really inefficient trade procedures and infrastructure, plus a deep lack of trust between countries, and of course, the persistent regional conflicts. These stem from all sorts of issues: political differences, border disputes that never get resolved, minority issues, and the ongoing problem of terrorism. It all adds up.
And the consequence of all this lack of cooperation and these high costs, what's the bigger impact on the region's economy? And what's the call to action?
Well, it creates a kind of negative cycle, doesn't it? Less cooperation means less capacity for innovation. It holds back domestic production because companies can't easily source parts or sell within the region, and it discourages investment. Ultimately, that means fewer jobs, less wealth being created, just a huge missed opportunity for everyone. The author's conclusion is pretty clear. South Asian countries need to actively work on boosting trade among themselves. And that really means finding ways to set aside some of those bilateral conflicts, at least enough to focus on shared economic benefits.
All right, from regional trade dynamics, let's zoom into India's own economy. There's a piece by Pulapur Balakrishnan that offers a really nuanced, maybe even challenging perspective on some recent economic news. On the surface, we hear inflation is down. Sounds good, right? But what does Balakrishnan argue we're missing?
Yeah, the May figures showed inflation under 3%, which is within the target range. And, that got a lot of positive press. But Balakrishnan points out something that got almost zero attention. In the very same month, unemployment actually went up. It rose from 5.1% in April to 5.8% in May. And his point is, look, for someone who's looking for a job and can't find one, lower inflation doesn't really mean much, does it? They're still unemployed. It's a critical perspective.
So his critique is basically that just looking at inflation while ignoring unemployment isn't really a credible way to judge how the economy's doing for actual people. What else is being overlooked in the official story?
Well, GDP growth has been a big talking point for the government, right? But Balakrishnan highlights that GDP growth actually slowed down quite a bit. It went from 9.2% in 2023-24 down to 6.5% in 2024-25. And that slowdown lines up perfectly with the rise in unemployment we just talked about. He notes this decline happened across most sectors of the economy, too. The only real exception was public administration. So it suggests a broader slowdown beneath the surface.
Okay, so if growth slowed and unemployment rose, how does he explain the drop in inflation? It challenges that standard idea that, monetary policy fixed it.
Exactly. Balakrishnan argues it probably wasn't about interest rates. He suggests it was more likely due to faster growth in the agricultural sector. Better harvests basically narrowed the gap between supply and demand for food, and we see that in the numbers. Food price inflation dropped dramatically from almost 11% in October 2024 to less than 1% by May 2025. He even cites his own econometric research from June 2025, saying there's actually no conclusive proof that interest rates control inflation in India. But there is overwhelming evidence showing the impact of agricultural prices. It's a pretty significant reframing.
And his final points about household inflation expectations, what do those tell us? It seems people weren't really feeling that drop in inflation.
That's right. Even though the official inflation rate fell, the Reserve Bank of India's own surveys showed that households expected inflation to stay high. Those expectations barely changed between March and May 2025, and they were way above the RBI's 4% target. This suggests, first, that the official numbers weren't matching people's lived experience, and second, that inflation targeting alone couldn't have been the main driver of the drop. And then there's the RBI governor saying he'd be willing to lower the repo rate if inflation keeps falling. Balakrishnan reads that as implying monetary policy in India is more reactive, it follows inflation trends rather than actively setting them.
Okay, wow. Now, let's shift gears dramatically from economics and policy to something really fundamental about, well, life itself. Data reports on a fascinating scientific discovery. For ages, the thinking's been that multicellular life evolved mainly through, slow genetic changes over time. But this new research suggests something else might have come first.
Yes, this is really thought-provoking stuff. It's a new study from Nishant Narayanasamy and Shashi Thutapalli's lab at NCBS, working with Georgia Tech, published in Science Advances just this June 2025. And what they're suggesting is quite radical, that purely physical and chemical processes by themselves could have nudged unicellular organisms towards becoming multicellular. And this could have happened before the major genetic changes we usually associate with multicellularity kicked in. It flips the script a bit.
That is a big shift.
Yeah.
Tell us about this snowflake yeast they studied. What was the mystery there?
Okay, so snowflake yeast isn't some exotic species. It's basically regular yeast, but with one tiny genetic tweak. This tweak stops the new buds, the daughter cells, from breaking off after they form. So they stay attached, creating these clusters that look a bit like snowflakes. The puzzle was, how did these clusters keep growing, getting bigger and bigger exponentially, just in a simple sugar solution? They don't have blood vessels or anything like plants or animals do to transport nutrients step inside. So based on simple diffusion, the cells in the middle should have starved once the cluster got too big, but they didn't.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. How did the yeast manage it then? How did they defy that expectation?
It turns out the answer wasn't complex biology, but simple physics, a process called advection. Advection is just when the fluid itself moves around, carrying dissolved stuff with it. So as the yeast cluster consumes glucose and churns out waste products like alcohol and CO2, the liquid immediately around it becomes slightly less dense. This less dense fluid naturally starts to rise, and that creates a gentle, continuous flow, a current. It acts like a tiny self-generated motor, constantly bringing fresh, nutrient-rich fluid towards the cluster, feeding even the cells inside. They tested it with dead yeast clusters, no flow. It was the living process driving the physics.
That's incredible. Just a consequence of metabolism creating a physical flow. What are the bigger implications of this for how we think about evolution?
It's potentially huge for understanding the origins of complex life. Vidyanan Nanjundia, who's an evolutionary biologist, commented on the study, saying this suggests multicellularity could actually start and be maintained just based on physics and chemistry alone. The genetic changes we usually focus on might have come later, perhaps locking in those structures that physics initially made possible. Thutapalli, one of the lead researchers, summed it up really well. He said, our view of biology shouldn't just be limited to what we see evolved out in nature. We need to look at these novel things happening in the lab, too, because they reveal fundamental principles, what he called genuinely a feature of livingness, how life can organize itself.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, let's swing back to geopolitics for our next piece, this time focusing on Pakistan and its very complex role in the whole U.S.-West Asia situation. DP Srivastava lays out a really intricate picture.
Yes. Srivastava starts with the immediate context. The U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. And then highlights something quite unusual, a private lunch. Pakistan's army chief, General Munir, had lunch with U.S. President Donald Trump on June 18th. This was apparently right after Israel's attacks on Iran began. A private lunch between an army chief and a U.S. president is not standard protocol. It signals something significant is happening.
So what's the U.S. interest here? Why this focus on Pakistan now? Especially since, as the article notes, the India-Pakistan tensions had sort of calmed down recently. It wasn't about that, was it?
No, it seems the U.S. focus here is squarely on West Asia. That region is just far more critical strategically for the U.S., mainly because of economic interests, oil primarily, and of course, ensuring Israel's security. The CNTCOM chief, General Kurilla, even testified praising Pakistan as a valuable partner, specifically for counterterrorism efforts. This is despite, Pakistan's history sometimes complicating U.S. efforts in Afghanistan. Srivastava mentions former PM Imran Khan's comments after the U.S. withdrawal as an example, but Kurilla's testimony was clearly focused on deterring Iran and seeing Pakistan as potentially helpful in that.
Okay, but what about Pakistan and Iran themselves? Their relationship must be incredibly complicated now if Pakistan is potentially aligning with the U.S. against Iran.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very complex dynamic. They compete for influence, especially in Afghanistan. Pakistan is also very proud of being the only declared Muslim nuclear power and likely isn't keen on Iran joining that club. And remember, there are those missile exchanges between them just earlier in 2024 linked to attacks by Pakistan-based groups on Iranian forces. But strategically, Pakistan could play a role in isolating Iran. Iran needs food imports, and if Gulf shipping routes are disrupted, land routes through Pakistan become vital. They share 5 border trading posts. And ironically, Iran actually supplies electricity to Pakistan's Gwadar port.
And the article mentions a specific action, Pakistan closing its land borders with Iran around June 15th. That timing seems significant, right around when General Munir was heading to Washington.
Exactly. That timing strongly suggests it wasn't a coincidence, likely part of a coordinated geopolitical signal or move. And you have to see all this against the backdrop of Pakistan's really dire economic situation. I mean, the country's had something like 25 IMF bailouts. They just got new commitments for $1.4 billion and $1 billion more. Yet look at their latest budget for FY 2025-26. They cut overall spending by 7%, slashed the development budget by 50%, but increased defense spending by over 17% to $11.65 billion.
Wow. And the article mentions interest payments alone are more than the federal government's revenue.
That's right. Interest payments now exceed the federal government's share of revenue, which basically means all other government functions are running on borrowed money. This desperate economic reality undoubtedly shapes Pakistan's foreign policy choices and makes external support, like from the US or IMF, absolutely critical.
So it really seems like Pakistan is juggling some major internal contradictions while playing this high-stakes regional game. Shrivastava mentions General Munir talking about Pakistan's superior ideology, but also the ongoing conflict in Balochistan, and even reports of the army supporting Sunni extremists attacking Shia pilgrims. How does that square with supporting Gaza rhetorically while maybe working with the U.S. against Iran?
It paints a picture of deep paradoxes, doesn't it? You have this ideological rhetoric alongside serious internal conflicts and instability, the reported support for extremist groups attacking Shias, while simultaneously expressing solidarity with Gaza. It highlights a very complex, maybe even contradictory approach. It suggests Pakistan's actions are driven by a volatile mix of internal pressures, ideology, the absolute need for economic survival, and trying to maximize its strategic importance to gain leverage and aid. It's a constant precarious balancing act.
Okay, for our final piece, let's shift to climate science, and a concept that might be new to many listeners. Thirstwaves. GBS MP Varma's article introduces this. What exactly is a thirst wave? Is it just another name for a heat wave?
Not exactly, though they're related. So first, there's evaporative demand. Think of it as how thirsty the atmosphere is, how much water it wants to pull from the land surface, assuming the water is there. Researchers meet Paul Kukal and Mike Hobbins coined thirst wave to describe a specific event. 3 or more consecutive days where this evaporative demand is intensely high. Unlike a heat wave, which is mainly about temperature, a thirst wave is caused by a combination of factors. Yes, high temperature, but also low humidity, lots of sunshine, solar radiation, and strong winds. All these things work together to suck moisture out of the land and plants.
Okay, so it's a more complex measure of atmospheric dryness stress.
Yeah.
How's it measured?
A common way to measure evaporative demand is using something called standardized short crop evapotranspiration. It's a calculation that gives farmers, for instance, a practical number to help them decide when and how much to irrigate their crops, because it directly reflects how much water the atmosphere is trying to pull out. Higher values mean it's hotter, drier, windier, sunnier, basically, prime conditions for drying things out fast.
Right. And Kukal and Hobbins found these thirst waves are getting worse in the U.S. What about India? Has this been studied here, given how crucial agriculture and water are?
Well, there was some older research, like a study back in 1997 by Chattopadhyay and Holm, that actually suggested evaporation might be decreasing in some parts of India, perhaps due to higher humidity. But, and this is the critical point Marma's article makes, when it comes to these extreme multi-day thirst wave events, there's basically no data for India. Despite India being incredibly vulnerable to climate change, despite the massive reliance on agriculture, these intense drying events just haven't been systematically tracked or studied. It's a major knowledge gap.
That sounds like a really significant gap, potentially dangerous even. What are the implications of not understanding these thirst waves in the Indian context? And is anything being done?
It's hugely significant, yes. Especially for food security and water management in a region supporting billions of people. Kukal is actually working on this now, hosting a PhD student, Shelza Sharma, specifically to investigate thirst wave patterns over South Asia to start filling this gap. And they already found something intriguing. Their preliminary work suggests the worst thirst waves don't always happen in the places with the absolute highest average evaporative demand. That means our current ideas about which areas are most at risk and where climate adaptation resources should go might need rethinking. We might need to focus more on vulnerability to these extreme events, not just average conditions. The takeaway is clear. We urgently need to start tracking, measuring, and reporting these thirst waves, and making sure farmers and water managers are aware of this specific type of climate threat.
So, as we wrap up today, we've journeyed from the physics possibly driving early life, through complex economic realities hidden beneath headlines, to the intricate dance of geopolitics shaped by history and necessity. It really leaves you thinking. In this incredibly interconnected world, what are those fundamental forces, physical, economic, political forks, that are truly shaping the events we see, often in ways that aren't immediately obvious? Thank you for listening. If today's deep dive gave you something useful, consider following us on Spotify so you're the first to hear the next one. You can get suggestions by contacting us on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. We are always eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.